So, really the basis of bubble stability and bubble dissolution was determined mathematically in 1950 by Epstein and Plesset at Caltech. And they published a seminal paper, and then everybody sort of tags on extra terms on top of that. So there's different types of terms, mass transfer terms for the lipid shell, and also mechanics of the lipid shell that can be added to improve the model for bubble dissolution. So let's start with the derivation of the Epstein and Plesset equation. So it's important to derive it because it's important to understand the physical principles that underlie this equation. Right? And what are the assumptions and what are the basic driving forces for bubble dissolution? So this is a snapshot of the paper, the title of the paper by Epstein and Plesset on the stability of gas bubbles in liquid gas solutions. And again, it was published in 1950. And here's their version of the equation. And so we're going to use some slightly different symbols for different terms, but essentially we're going to get the same equation. The one thing that's going to be different is we're not going to have this time-dependent term, because it turns out that this time-dependent term basically goes to zero very quickly. That bubble dissolution is slow compared to diffusion of the gas and the establishment of the concentration profile. Okay, so we're going to have a fully developed concentration profile as the bubble dissolves. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. And here's one of the predictions, one of the plots that's a prediction. On this axis is a normalized bubble radius, and on this plot is a normalized time. And so the bubble starts at some initial radius, and then it dissolves, and the dissolution rate accelerates as the bubble gets smaller. So the curvature of this curve is to bend and become very steep here at the end. That's typical for bubble dissolution. There's three different conditions here. So the solid curve is the radius time behavior for a gas bubble in an oversaturated solution with surface tension neglected. With surface tension neglected. So that's this guy here. And then with the dash curve, effective surface tension, initial bubble radius of 10 to the negative 30 centimeters. And it's for an air-water combination. That is a surface tension of about 73 millimeters per meter. And this is Henry's constant essentially for air and water, okay, 0.02. Okay, so I'm going to start at basics with the chemical potential. And I want to point out Josiah Willard Gibbs because he's the one who invented the chemical potential. And he's kind of a hero of mine, and I think sort of a hero of the American scientific community. He was actually the first person in the United States to get a PhD in engineering at Yale University. And his PhD was on gear design. So it was a component, like a mechanical engineering component design dissertation. And but he went on to develop the Gibbs free energy, a mathematical basis for thermodynamics, and specifically chemical engineering thermodynamics. So one of the things that he realized was you could have a chemical potential that drives the transport, that is a gradient that drives the transport of mass. And so we call that the chemical potential. It's often given the mu with the subscript for the particular species that you're talking about, because each chemical species will have its own chemical potential. Everybody read that okay? It's somewhat small font, so I'll read it. So the total energy, capital U, is a function of entropy, volume, and composition. So this is the basic idea. You have M components. So U is a function of entropy, S, volume, V, and then components. And these N is the number of moles of that component. And you have components 1, 2, 3, all the way up to component down. Okay? So if you take the total differential of the energy, du, you'll get a series of expressions, one for the entropy, one for the volume, and one for the number of moles. And it's a summation over all of the different species. So you're going to get an expression here, a term here, for each species in your system. So the chemical potential is actually defined as this part. So du d sub ni, constant entropy, constant volume, and n sub j are the number of moles of all the other components. Okay? So what we're looking at, the chemical potential, is defined as the change in the total energy versus the change in the number of molecules of a specific component. And you'll have a different chemical potential for each species. Right? So the total differential energy then becomes TdS, that becomes T, PdV, that becomes P, and then the summation of that becomes mu, V, and I. Okay? And this is probably an expression that you're familiar with if you're taking thermodynamics before. Okay? So at constant temperature and pressure, then the chemical potential can also be defined as a change in Gibbs free energy versus the change in the number of molecules of that species at constant temperature and pressure. So you can also relate it to the Gibbs free energy. And the Gibbs free energy is negative S dt, dDp, and then the summation of your chemical potential times d and I. So that's in terms of the chemical potential. So the chemical potential can be determined, but in terms of the total energy, the Gibbs free energy, the Helmholtz free energy, and even the enthalpy under different conditions. Okay, so for multiphase heterogeneous systems, and that's our system, because we have a gas bubble and a liquid medium. So it's multiphase. One phase is the gas, one phase is the medium. The chemical potential is a partial molar Gibbs free energy, as we just saw. A heterogeneous system is made up of two phases, gas and water, with each phase considered an open system within an overall closed system. Okay? So we'll simplify the analysis by saying the gas and liquid are free to exchange with each other, but they're participating in the same environment. We neglect special forces such as surface forces, semi-permeable membranes, like in reverse osmosis or something like that, and body forces such as electromagnetic forces or gravitational forces. We'll consider the internal equilibrium between the phases. So at thermal equilibrium, the temperature in phase 1 will be equal to the temperature in phase 2, and all the temperature in all the phases from 1 to pi are going to be the same. Now pi is the total number of phases. In this case, we're just looking at a two-phase system, but you could have multiple phases, right? And typically we use that symbol pi for the number of phases. Mechanical equilibrium is described as the pressure in each of these phases are equal. So the pressure in phase 1 is equal to pressure in phase 2, etc. This is for fluid flow. Okay? And phase equilibrium is defined as the chemical potential of each species is going to be equal in each of the phases. Okay? So that's chemical equilibrium, or often we call it thermodynamic equilibrium, particularly in chemical engineering terminology or chemical thermodynamics. Okay, so it's kind of interesting to look at these different potential gradients, temperature, pressure, and chemical potential. You'll get heat transfer when you have a temperature gradient. That is when these temperatures are not equal, right? Then you'll have heat transfer, energy transfer in the form of heat. You have fluid flow if there's a pressure gradient, and you'll have mass transfer if there's a chemical potential gradient. So this is, I think, interesting to understand. Often I'm working with mechanical engineering students who don't take chemi thermodynamics, obviously, and so they need a little bit of a review of this. So for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with chemical thermodynamics, this is basically just a term. You can think of it like pressure or like temperature. It's driving transport. But what it's doing is it's driving the net flux of molecules in one direction or the other. And just to go back a second, just the way that heat goes from high temperature to low temperature, and fluid flows from high pressure to low pressure, mass will transfer from high chemical potential to low chemical potential. When you're talking about bubbles in liquid media, often it's helpful to use a fugacity. And a fugacity is like the chemical potential. It's actually directly related to chemical potential, but it has units of pressure instead of units of energy. And often you're interested in partial pressures of gases, so it's often very useful for, in particular, gas-liquid contact systems. So fuga means flight or escape in Latin. So that's where fugacity comes from. It's kind of a funny word, and it's one of those words that always ends up in the chemical engineering t-shirts. The chemical potential then is related to temperature and pressure through the Gibbs free energy. Okay. So you have S sub I. This is the entropy of that species, and this is the volume of that species. So mu I does not have an immediate equivalent in the physical world. This chemical potential. Okay. Whereas temperature and pressure, you can measure pressure, you can measure temperature, you can't measure the chemical potential. So it's therefore desirable to express mu in terms of some auxiliary function that might be more easily identified with physical reality. So this is a concept that comes from Krausen's books on molecular thermodynamics of fluid contact systems. And for those of you who haven't read it, I would highly recommend it, particularly the first couple of chapters. I think there are beautiful descriptions of thermodynamics. Consider the chemical potential for a pure ideal gas. So for a pure gas, this is volume per number of moles, is Bt over P. B I'm using as the universal gas coefficient. Most people use R, but we use R in the bubble world for the radius of the bubble. So we're going to scrap R, keep that for bubble radius, and we'll use B instead. Okay. So Bt over P. So the change in chemical potential then is Bt ln of P over some P naught. So if you integrate this, you get this equation, and you have some standard state. Some standard state with a zero in the superscript. Okay. So at constant temperature, this abstract quantity, chemical potential, is a simple logarithmic function of the physically real quantity, pressure. Okay. So you can relate, at least for this pure ideal gas, you can relate this abstract quantity to a real measurable quantity, pressure. That's really the power of liquid gas. More generally, for any real multi-component gas, phase, gas, liquid, or solid, you can define, instead of pressure, you can put in fugacity that has units of pressure, force per unit area. So the essential value of fugacity is that it simply relates a mathematical abstraction, that is, the chemical potential, to a common intensive property of the real world, that is pressure. And for phase equilibrium, just the way that we had the chemical potentials equal for each species in each phase, the fugacities will be equal in each phase for each species. Okay? So everybody following to this point? Okay. So that's the first important concept. Okay? If there's a fugacity gradient, there will be mass transport. Okay. Now I'm going to show you why there is a fugacity gradient in a bubble, in a microbubble, unless you have a shell. But if you don't have a shell, then you'll get a fugacity gradient. So why is that? Well, the first concept is to understand is surface tension, and I think it's worth it to understand the molecular origin of surface tension. It's not just an abstract mathematical quantity, it's a real thing. It's why drops and bubbles are spherical to begin with, and it's actually the main driver of bubble dissolution. So there's different ways, this comes from Jacob Israel-Billy's book, there's different ways that you can conceive the surface tension. I think this is the best. I prefer this one. You can take a molecule from the bulk to a surface. In the bulk phase, the molecule is surrounded in 3 dimensions by other solid molecules. And it's a liquid. So we know that those solid molecules like to attract each other or interact in a favorable, energetically favorable way. Okay? So if you take this molecule and you bring it to the surface, you're changing the number of nearest neighbor molecules that solvent molecule can interact with. And because those interactions are favorable, now you take away some of those favorable interactions, that requires energy. So it requires energy to take a bulk molecule and bring it to the surface. Okay? Another way to think of it is if you have a molecule that happens to be at a surface, it's going to minimize its own energy, free energy, to go back into the bulk. So these molecules, the energetics are going to favor a diffusion of the molecules away from the interface. And you can imagine that this molecule goes away, that molecule goes away, and that molecule goes away. And as they're going away, the surface is contracting. So in my mind, I think that's the, sort of a nice, elegant way to think about how the origin of surface tension. It's not just this force, its molecules are leaving the interface, and the interface is shrinking as a consequence. Okay, so it turns out that surface tension plus curvature leads to Laplace pressure. Sometimes it's called the Laplace-Young equation, but often we just abbreviate it and call it the Laplace pressure. And you can derive a Laplace pressure. There's a lot of different ways. Folks have used different ways to derive the Laplace pressure. This is what I think is like the basic, easiest way to derive it. If you just consider the top hemisphere of a bubble, okay, so just consider this top hemisphere, then the force that's acting up on this top hemisphere is equal to the pressure difference, I should say, where the pressure difference is between Pi, that's the pressure inside the bubble, and Po is the pressure outside the bubble. So Pi is in, Po is out. So it's the difference in these two pressures times the surface area of the bottom of this hemisphere. That's what's pushing up on this. Imagine just this top hemisphere. Okay? And then what's pushing down is this surface tension times the perimeter of this hemisphere, of the bottom of this hemisphere. So that's what's pulling down. And at mechanical equilibrium, this is where we're defining mechanical equilibrium. This is why we say the bubble, even if it's in mechanical equilibrium, it's not in thermodynamic equilibrium. But here we're assuming it's in mechanical equilibrium. So these forces are equal. You can set those terms equal and solve for the difference in pressure. And that comes out to be 2 times sigma, which is the surface tension, divided by r, which is the primary radius of curvature. So 2 sigma over r. What to notice is that the pressure is going to be linearly proportional to surface tension, and it's inversely proportional to radius. The smaller the radius, the bigger the pressure. For a microbubble, in SI units, this value is 10 to the negative 6. So that means delta P is on the order of 10 to the 6, right? And then we have surface tension, which is on the order of, for a pure gas liquid interface, is 73 millimeters per meter, or 0.07 newtons per meter. Okay. So overall, a micron-sized bubble will actually be on the order of 10 to the 5th pascals, or 10 to the 5th newtons per meter squared, which is about an atmosphere. So even if P naught is 1 atmosphere at sea level, inside the bubble will actually be at 2 atmospheres. Okay? And as the bubble radius gets larger, this delta P diminishes very, very quickly. Okay? So the smaller the bubble is, the higher the pressure difference. Okay. Another important concept is for mass transfer. We like, in engineering, we like to use these non-dimensional terms. Again, I often have mechanical engineers, so I'm going to introduce the Nussel number and the Sherwood number. Sherwood number is obviously what we're going to use, but Nussel number is heat transfer. And it's a non-dimensional number that's made up. It's an engineering number, but it's really useful because it relates the heat transfer coefficient, H, to some length scale and a thermal diffusivity or thermal conductivity. Actually, this is thermal conductivity. So you have an unknown value, H, that's related to known values, L and K. And then you can calculate that if you know the Reynolds number and the Prandtl. Okay, so you can calculate the Nussel number, that comes out at some number, and then you can solve for H. Okay. Well, there's an analogy in mass transfer called the Sherwood number. And it looks very similar. Instead of a heat transfer coefficient, you have a mass transfer coefficient. You still have a length. And instead of a thermal conductivity, you have a mass diffusivity. And it's also a function of Reynolds number. And instead of the Prandtl number, it's the Schmidt number. And this is going to be, in particular, it's going to be the Reynolds number and the Schmidt number are going to be for the case where we have fluid flow. So K is the mass transfer coefficient. It's an analogy to Newton's law of cooling for mass transfer. This is often called the fixed law. Okay, the flux is proportional to the concentration of liquids. L is some characteristic length, V is mass diffusivity, Reynolds number, Schmidt number. Okay, so for a sphere, the Nussel number, which is equal to 2 to H, or so, yeah, that's the Nussel number, H times the diameter, 2 times the radius over the thermal conductivity, is some function, and it's equal to 2 plus some constant, depending on the type of flow that you have, times the Reynolds number to the power of n, times the Prandtl number to the power of n. Okay? Now, the Sherwood number is analogous. So instead of the heat transfer coefficient, we have the mass transfer coefficient, the diameter, and the mass diffusivity. What's interesting is it has a very similar structure. 2 plus some constant times the Reynolds number to some power times the Schmidt number to some power. We're going to consider the case where it's just a microbubble in a stagnant fluid, so there's no Reynolds number, and Sherwood number just equals 2. That is for pure, what we call pure diffusion. In other words, diffusion without convection. Okay. So this number is equal to 2. If that number is equal to 2, you can solve for the mass transfer coefficient. It's simply equal to the diffusivity over R. So if you think about that in terms of Fick's equation, in Fick's equation, you have the diffusivity over some length. This gives you the thickness of the concentration gradient, of the concentration boundary layer. It's equal to the radius of the bubble. So the bigger the bubble, the larger the profile that the concentration changes for the surface of the bubble and the bulk fluid. As the bubble gets smaller, that concentration, that thickness of that boundary layer gets smaller. So this is for pure diffusion, and it's for steady diffusion. That is, the concentration profile is fully developed. Okay? In Epstein and Plesset's original formulation, they had a more general term for the establishment of the concentration profile, but it's been subsequently shown in numerous studies that there is no, the transient is so fast that it becomes negligible. Okay, so let's start really developing the Epstein-Plesset equation. And as good chemical engineers, we'll start with a mass balance around the bubble. So most chemical engineers take MEB, material energy balances, in their sophomore year. So this is really sophomore place to start, but it's an important place to start. So remember this accumulation equals what comes in minus what goes out, plus what's generated minus what's lost, but we don't have any chemical reactions. It's just diffusion. So we only have flux in and flux out. Divided by the surface area, and we get it in terms of the number of moles. So we can use the mass transfer coefficient for those flux terms. So flux becomes K times delta C, well, K times C in minus K times C out. Just factor out the K. This is the concentration in the bulk, C infinity. This is the concentration at the surface, C sigma. So this is just a mass balance. Accumulation is what comes in minus what comes out. You can rearrange those terms. All we're doing is changing the order of the subtraction, and then we get a negative sign here. Why do we do this? Well, because we always usually have a higher concentration at the bubble surface than in the bulk, because of the lost pressure, it creates a higher concentration here than in the bulk, and so this term will be positive, which leads to a negative term here, so we get loss of gas. Okay? So this is a convenience setting it up because we know that we're going to have dissolving rules. We plug in a Sherwood number correlation for K, that's just D diffusivity over R radius of the bubble. Okay, the next concept that we need to apply is Henry's law. So the solubility of gas and liquid increases with pressure according to this expression. And this is, I'm using the definition of it the way it was defined in Kraussman's book. Okay? There's a million different ways that Henry's law can be defined because there's always different units you can use. But here it's defined in terms of fugacity and mole fraction, and then it's given this constant H. It's not necessarily constant, it depends on the temperature composition of those things. So F sub 2, that's the fugacity of the gas inside the bubble, in the gas phase. X sub 2 is the mole fraction of gas in the liquid medium out here. Okay? And H is just a response. So let's define Henry's law in terms of a concentration C because that's what we had in the mass balance equation. And if we do that, now we call it, instead of H, we call this L. So if we rearrange, we solve for C sub 2, we get L times F sub 2. I didn't talk about it, there's a limit here. The limit is that the mole fraction goes to 0. This is going to be valid for gas dissolved in the water. There's a lot of water molecules and very, very fluid amount of gas molecules. So same here for concentration. Let's go to 0. So at the liquid side of the bubble surface, then C naught, this is equal to L times F naught, where F naught is the fugacity. And in the bulk medium, C infinity is equal to L of F infinity. Okay? This is the fugacity out here. Okay? So if the medium is saturated, this will probably be the 1 atmosphere pressure, right? Or the whatever working pressure you're dealing with, the hydrostatic pressure that you're dealing with. That'll be the fugacity. And then it will have a corresponding concentration. So if we plug this value here and this value here into that mass balance, now we have fugacities, okay? And L, which is Henry's constant converted, is right here. Now, this is the mass balance. If the bubble comprises an ideal gas, then the fugacity is equal to the pressure. The fugacity of whatever component I is equal to partial pressure of component I. Right? But the fugacity inside the bubble F naught is equal to Pi inside the bubble. The bubble pressure includes both the hydrostatic and Laplace pressure terms. So P sub I is equal to P naught, the outside pressure, plus, we just derived this, 2 sigma over R, the Laplace pressure, 2 times surface tension divided by the radius of the bubble. So the bulk phase is at some partial pressure relative to saturation. It could be degassed, it could be supersaturated. So we'll say there's partial pressure, or there's overall hydrostatic pressure, P naught, and then the fugacity out here will be some fraction of that. If it's saturated, then alpha will just be equal to 1. If it's undersaturated, then alpha will be less than 1. If it's supersaturated, like in the case of decompression thickness in the bends, alpha would be greater than 1. So typically though, alpha is going to vary between 0 and 1, alpha equal 1 being saturated. So if we plug those terms in for fugacities, then the hydrostatic pressure comes out, and we get 1 minus alpha plus 2 times sigma over r, and we factored out the P naught here. So we have a P naught here, so that we can factor it out. And these are all unitless numbers in here, overall non-dimensional numbers in here. Okay, we're not quite done yet. We have to determine something for the number of moles in terms of the radius. Okay? So we apply the ideal gas law. N is equal to PV over B. That's again the ideal gas constant times T. The pressure inside the bubble is P naught plus 2 sigma over R. Hydrostatic pressure plus Laplace pressure times volume over T. And you can differentiate that with respect to time. You differentiate both sides with respect to time. We add the volume of the sphere here. We plug this in, 4/3 pi r cubed in here. And this is what we get. BT, those are going to be constant. We're assuming it's isothermal, so that's not changing with time, so we can pull out temperature. And then if you differentiate these terms, then you get P naught is again a constant, 4/3 pi r squared times r dot, that's dr dt. R dot is dr dt. And then 4 times sigma over 3r times 4 pi r squared dr dt. And you can simplify this, pull out the r dot, okay. Pull out the surface area, which is 4 pi r squared, which you have on both sides, both here and here. And then all that's left over here is a P naught, that's the hydrostatic pressure. And all that's left over here is 4 times sigma over 3 times r. So now we can plug that back in. We have the mass balance from the ideal gas law for a spherical bubble with Laplace pressure. We have this. So now we'll combine these two equations, okay, here, here, and we'll solve for r dot. And we want negative r dot because it's going to be dissolving bubble. So we wind up getting B times T, ideal gas times temperature, times D, which comes from, which is the mass diffusivity, which comes from Sherwood number approximation, times L, is the Henry's constant, in terms of concentration, moles per unit of volume, times hydrostatic pressure over bubble radius r. And then we have a term on the top, 1 minus alpha, 2 times sigma over rp, and then we got a term on the bottom, not 4 times sigma over 3r. Okay, that's this term. So this is a nonlinear ordinary differential equation with the initial conditions that initially the radius is at some radius of dot, and initially the radius isn't moving at all. It's stable. Those are your initial conditions. So, from this equation, you should be able to see right away that larger bubbles will dissolve more slowly in smaller bubbles. Okay? Because R is right here in the denominator. So if R is bigger, then this whole term is smaller, so that R dot is smaller. Also, if we look here, we have 1 minus alpha. Alpha is equal to 1 if the surrounding medium is saturated. So 1 minus 1 is 0. The only thing then left is this term. This is what's driving the solution. So 2 sigma over R times B naught. So if R is bigger, then this whole term gets smaller, and so the driving force is also smaller. Conversely, if R gets smaller, then this gets bigger. So it gets bigger, so R dot, the dissolution rate is faster through this term and through this term. Okay. So all bubbles with surface tension will dissolve, even in saturated medium, even when alpha is equal to 1, and that term goes good. Unless the surface tension is equal to 0. And if that happens, if surface tension is equal to 0, then this whole term goes to 0. Everybody agree with that? So only when surface tension is equal to 0 will the bubble be stable. That is our diagnosis here. So this equation has been validated a number of times. I think kind of the most recent one is by is kind of an elegant one that was done by Duncan and Needham. I think in 2005, 2006, earlier. And what they did was they took a micropipette and they held a bubble stationary in air-saturated medium under microscope stage. And they just simply watched the bubble dissolve with video microscopy. So it requires some micromanipulators to grab a bubble, hold it in place, and a microscope and a camera and recording. But it's a relatively simple, straightforward experiment to do. And the nice thing about it is you're taking the bubble away from the surface. So you can really test it in some classic equation. The problem with the equation as we derive it is it assumes that the bubble is an isotropic medium that's stagnant. But when you put the bubble next to a surface, then there's a boundary that you can't have diffusion through. And that'll slow down the dissolution. You can actually account for that by just dividing the F10 plus equation by ln of 2. So if you have a boundary there, you can make that simplification. Okay, so when they did these experiments, they used some different surfactants, and they saw the bubble radius changing as a function of time. And they saw it follow the predictions of the F10 plus equation. So they also tested lipid-coated bubbles, and a lipid-coated bubble did not dissolve, at least out to 160 seconds, in their experiment. The bubble was what they called indefinitely stable. It wasn't changing in size. What you see, the little ups and downs, it's just thermal motion of the bubble. The bubble's small enough that it actually exhibits boundary motion. And well, even though it's being held by a micropipette, it's still exhibiting boundary motion. So they did kind of a similar experiment to the experiment that I told you that David Kim did with measuring the mechanical properties of the lipid shell. They have a transfer pipette that they sheath over the bubble that's being held with the other pipette so that they can move from a saturated to an unsaturated mean. That is alpha. Alpha, the expression that I showed you, what they're calling F. Okay? And F goes from 1 to 0.9 to 0.93 to 0.84, and you can see the bubble is dissolving. So if it has a lipid shell, it dissolves, okay, if you put it in a degassed environment. So this allows us to completely rule out this concept that the lipid film is impermeable, and that's what's stabilizing the bubble. Because the bubble is acting like an Epstein plus bubble when you put it in a degassed environment. So it's the surface tension reducing ability of the lipid that's stabilizing the bubble. And we're quite confident about that at this stage. So you can have, because of surface tension, bubbles will dissolve. You can exchange, instead of having an air bubble, you can use the least soluble gas that we know of in water, perfluorobutane, that can be used in vivo. And you can extend the life by 1 to a little over 2 orders of magnitude, almost 3 orders of magnitude. But it's still going to dissolve before a minute. So just adding perfluorobutane doesn't stabilize the bubble indefinitely. But what it does do is it does give you a minute of stability, and that can be useful for allowing lipid to absorb around the surface and stabilize the surface. And then once you have a stabilized surface, you can have either air or PFD in the gas core, right? So it buys you time. It buys you some stability just to put the lipid shell on, and the lipid shell gives you the indefinite stability. Okay. Okay, so how are we going to get a very low surface tension? We use a lipid monolayer, right? So we've seen this cartoon before. We use a lipid monolayer. You can model also the bubble dissolution, and you have to account for the fact that the gas has to permeate through the lipid shell. And even at completely degassed environments, the lipid shell will partially stabilize an air bubble, so it will last out to about a second. This is a bubble radius, so it's a 5 micron diameter bubble. But a PFB bubble will last much longer, out to 10 to 15 seconds, even in degassed environments. So this is basically saying that the PFB, the shell, helps stabilize the bubble by reducing surface tension and impeding the transport. It helps stabilize the bubble, it retards the solution to have the retardation of the permeation of the gas. But ultimately, the stability, again, comes from the surface tension eliminating or diminishing capability of the lipid. Okay. So that's the Epstein-Plessis equation. Any questions on that before I move on? So I told you now that we're going to have to add a term for the diffusion of the gas in the lipid layer. And that is going to slow down the dissolution, but it's not going to stop the dissolution. So now I'm going to show you some work that led to this model, how you can simplify the Epstein-Plessis model, how you can modify the Epstein-Plessis model to account for resistance. Yeah.
We say that we use the surfactant near to zero, we need to go to more stable.
Right.
But you said that the bubbles which are made of surfactants, only surfactants, they will remain more stable in the suspension.
It depends. You can certainly find surfactants that will give you very low, maybe even zero surface tension. It happens that lipid does it. It's a biological molecule that does it, but there certainly can be surfactants that also lead to zero or near zero surface tension.
People might go then
It depends. It's not an easy problem to. It's not an easy question to answer because surfactants can do things like span and twinning, for example. You can use those to dissolve membranes. And what happens is there are micelles, and they come and they basically pull lipid out of the membrane and dissolve it into the aqueous phase as mixed micelles. And so what you might get this kind of interesting behavior that you weren't expecting, like this micellization, mixed micelle formation, and things like that. That's just one example. You could have lateral phase behavior between the surfactant and the lipid. So you have to be just careful that you're picking lipid that mixes well. If you want it with the surfactant you're interested in. I don't know if this has been done, but it's possible to make fluorocarbon-based lipids, fluorinated lipids, and you could have hydrocarbon lipids. Those may phase separate. And so even if they're both surfactants, so and if they phase separate, then you have to consider the mechanics of each phase, so its ability to diminish surface tension. So it depends on the surfactant. One could argue that PEG-40 stearate is a surfactant. You could argue it's a lipid, and you could argue it's a surfactant. And that's often used in total formulations with lipids.
That's right.
Yeah, so sometimes we typically call that the emulsifier because it prevents dissolution or coalescence of the bubble. And by doing so, it allows us to generate much more bubbles. So it's emulsifier. We're foaming instead of emulsifying, but it has that same property. So we often call it an emulsifier, the pegylated species. And then any species that provides that repulsive force between two bubbles that inhibits coalescence could be called an emulsifier. Yeah. Okay, any other questions on Epstein-Plessis equation? Okay, so it's in your notes, and I would recommend that if you have the time to read the original paper from 1950. Okay, so a long time ago, I tried to crack this problem also. And so I did an experiment. I think you guys have something set up similar to this concept, where you have a bubble under a microscope, and it's in some kind of a chamber or something, and you suddenly subject it to degassed liquid, and then you watch it dissolve, and you fit the model to the dissolution, to the radius versus time curve, and determine the mass transport properties. Okay? So we already know these are the properties we know: the diffusivity of air and water, the surrounding pressure, the Henry's constant, and you can desaturate the medium. So in this case, I desaturated the medium by 1/6. So the total saturated value, this total value of dissolved gas was 5/6 of the saturation value. So you get videos like this. Now this is a fluorescence microscopy video, but you can also do this in bright field microscopy. And I think that it's been demonstrated by Michelle Burschhaus's group that actually fluorescence microscopy is actually better for quantification of optical microscopy because we get a sharper edge definition. But the nice thing about it is you can also see what happens. What's the fate of the lipid as the bubble dissolves. So remember, it's the lipid that's fluorescently labeled here. You can see what happens to it. It's shedding off instead of in terms of vesicles. This is DLPC. DLPC is C12. Okay, so it's very short acyl chain and relatively soluble in water. Okay, so it's easy for this to shed. DLPC is C14. And C14 doesn't shed as easily. You can see these bubbles dissolving. And if you watch this video, you can see already these kind of tube-like structures that are formed from bubbles that were dissolving. Show that one more time. You see how it leaves kind of this mass of lipid behind and then subsequently goes apart and fuses away. And here's C18, so this is a longer chain lipid. One of the things that recognizes this bright field mode is that the bubble buckles and then snaps into a spherical shape, buckles and snaps into a spherical shape. So this is very common for longer chain lipids. You see this behavior. This is in fluorescence mode. Excuse me. So you can really see it crumpling and folding here. And what happens, you can kind of see what's happening in the shell here. You see these kind of buckling fracture moments in the shell. So you fracture here, and then the surface-associated lipid on the shell. You can kind of see it here too, it's surface-associated lipid on the shell. It doesn't break apart and fuse away as easily for C18 as it does for C12. Okay? One of the interesting things with bright field, and bubbles that we had stored for a long time, this was bubbles that had been stored for several months. I put them in this dissolution chamber just to see what would happen. And I got this interesting thing. I saw these like little hexagonal domains as the bubble was crumpling. So it would be smooth, and then it would start to crumple, and you would see these kind of domains. And then it would snap back to smooth, and then it would crumple again, and you would see more of these domains. And it was interesting because in bright field, you could almost see some domain flow altogether. And this is really indicating to us that there's some mechanical. The shells are imparting, the lipid is imparting some mechanical strength to the bubble. These are snapshots of bubbles that were coated with different lipids at different time points. So DMPC bubbles, they have short acyl chains, and it's not a very solid forming lipid. And so these bubbles were seen to remain spherical as they dissolve. They dissolve quickly, and they dissolve spherically symmetrically. Okay? But as we increase acyl chain length, so C16 was like this, but C17 we saw these folds, these drastic kind of crumpling and folding. But they would restore a nice spherical shape. And as we continue to increase C18, we would get some crumpling, and it would smoothen, but it wouldn't smooth to a nice spherical shape. And then now as we get to the longest lipid, it started in a non-spherical shape, and then when it crumpled and folded, you could see severe crumples. It looks like a raisin. And then it would smoothen again, but again, non-spherical. So, again, this indicates very, very low surface tension. In fact, all of these indicate very low surface tension. Right? Stated here, low surface tension. But particularly here, loss pressure is going to drive it to be spherical. If you plot the radius as a function of time, this is for the bubbles that are non-spherical, it's the equivalent spherical radius. So take the area and assume that that's the area of the sphere, so you get equivalent area, and therefore equivalent radius. You can see these are the dissolution curves. So you see 12, 14, 16, 18, 22, or 12, 16, 18, 20, and 22. So these are dissolving very smoothly, and these you start to see these jumps. Okay? As it buckles and snaps to spherical, buckles, snaps to spherical, and so on. But what's obvious here is that the longer chain lipids are taking longer to dissolve. So we had to account for the lipid shell in the mass transfer model. And we just assume it's another layer. So you have a boundary layer out here that's taken into account by the Epstein and Plus equation, and then you have a boundary layer here. You could even consider two boundary layers, the lipid and the pig brush layer. But the pig brush layer is mostly water, so probably the fusion through there is rapid, so it's really the lipid layer that's controlling it. So the mass balance on the bubble that we had before, and the mass transfer coefficient is the inverse of the mass transfer resistance. So instead of K, we're going to use omega. And the total resistance is the sum of the shell and water diffusion resistances. So here's the shell resistance, and then here is the resistance that we had before. Okay, remember that K was D over R, well, omega for the water phase is R over D. If you plug that back in here, now you get these two terms in the denominator. Go through the same steps with the Henry's law and the ideal gas law, and you get these terms here. So everything else is the same as the Epstein Plus equation, except we have this term here. If this term for the shell resistance goes to 0, you get the Epstein Plus equation. This plot shows radius as a function of time for with increasing surface tension, with decreasing amount of gas in the medium, with decreasing shell resistance. Base shell resistance is 500 here, it's 150 here, and so on. One of the things to point out about this is that the shell resistance flattens out the dissolution curve. It makes it appear to be almost more linear for much of the dissolution. And so when we took that model and we fit that data, we get these curves here, which gives us these resistances as a function of basic change. So we start down here at C12, and we work our way up here to C14. And so what is the nature of this relationship? Is it linear in here, or is it different here, or is it exponential? That was the last one of the questions that we were trying to see to explain. So this was from the dissolution of bubbles. We also measure the oxygen permeability of the shell using a microelectrode. Okay. So what we do is we apply voltage here at the interface that reduces oxygen to form water. That sets up a chemical potential gradient, so oxygen in the bubble diffuses through the monolayer shell, through the aqueous medium to the electrode. And by following the current on the electrode, you can determine then the the flux of oxygen, and then you can determine the shell permeability. So this just shows the geometry. It's a platinum, what they call an ultramicroelectrode. That is an electrode of only, I think it was 25 microns in diameter. These are relatively bigger bubbles in order to have a big enough bubble that's large enough with respect to the platinum. And it was held with a pipette. So you have a holding pipette here, a platinum electrode here, and they're in this chamber with you have to have a reference electrode here too. So you make these surfaces hydrophobic using surface sill, and then you can easily put water in here, and it attaches to the surfaces, but it doesn't spread on the surfaces, so it just attaches to the surfaces, and you get this nice bead of fluid, and then you can come at it from a different size with the holding pipette and the electrode, and then you can observe it with a microscope. This is an inverted microscope, and you can also do it with an upright. Just those snapshots. This is the microelectrode, this is the surface of the bubble, and by video microscopy, you can measure the length between the two. So D is the distance between the bubble and the electrode. A is the electrode radius. I is the steady state current, and I infinity is a steady state current at infinite separation. Okay. And so as you get closer to the bubble, the current increases, which shows that you are in fact reducing the bubble to dissolve. And the bubble has oxygen, so you're sort of measuring the oxygen profile as you're moving towards the bubble. And the lipid had an impact on that curve. So with some mass transport modeling, you can back out the resistance, and so here's the resistances at different shells. See 16, 18, 20, 22, 24. And the resistance of the shell goes from on the order of 100 to 1,000 or up to 2,000 seconds per second. And you can compare that to what we saw with the lipids. So when we did the dissolution experiments, we found much lower resistances than what we observed with the microelectrode, which is kind of interesting. We also showed that microstructure affects oxygen permeability. You can add microstructures on the surface of bubbles, as I showed you before, and you can heat them and cool them at different rates to get different microstructures. You can model, this is the diffusion region, so oxygen concentration decreases as you go from red to blue. At the electrode tip, you have the reaction happening out here, it's saturated, and then you have this diffusion region in between the bubble and the electrode tip. So you can measure with fluorescence microscopy the defect density, beta, and the gas permeability, here we call it P, and you can see that the permeability is increasing with defect density. And it also increases as we go from long chains to low chains. If you extrapolate all these curves to zero, so that you're imagining where you're trying to imagine a scenario in which defect density becomes negligible, so it's just like a nice uniform monolayer without defects, we get a nice linear plot when we plot acyl chain length versus the natural log of the permeability. So this fit told us that the mechanism for gas permeation through the monolayer is an activation process, it's an energy barrier model. It's not Fickian diffusion. It's an energy barrier model. Where as you increase the acyl chain, the energy barrier is increasing linearly, not the diffusion coefficient. Or not the permeability. The permeability, the resistance doesn't increase linearly with acyl chain length. The activation energy increases linearly with acyl chain. And that makes sense, because if you increase the acyl chain length, you increase the adhesive energy linearly. And that's the activation energy you have to overcome to have a molecule diffuse through the liquid. Okay, so there's been some other modeling of microbubbles that goes beyond what my lab has done. A nice paper that came out in 2009 was from Coach Starkar's group. This time it was at Delaware, but now it's at George Washington University. And he takes into account the effect of encapsulation, in particular the encapsulation of permeability. Also, your very own Samir has done a very nice paper. I would say this is probably the most comprehensive study of bubble dissolution at this point, taking into account all the different effects of gas permeation resistance as well as elasticity of the lipid shell. Okay. So this is a good paper to read to get a sense of the total, how each of these parameters come into effect in total bubble stability. Okay, so next we have the mechanics model. It's 10:05, so I think we have until 10:30. Okay. I'm going to give you guys just a second of a break while I change the batteries once again. Use the batteries. Okay, so I showed you a model for the, I showed you the Epstein plus equation, how it was derived, and then I showed you how you can modify the Epstein plus equation to account for the gas permeability. Now I'm going to show you some effects of the mechanics of the lipid shell. So you get some kind of sense that the mechanics are there because the bubbles like crumbling and folding, right? Those are mechanics. And there must be some influence of those mechanics on bubble dissolution. And we really saw this come into play when we wanted to pressurize bubbles. There's different reasons why we're interested in what happens when you pressurize bubbles. One of the reasons is because in the last lecture I'm going to talk about nanodrops, and one of the things you can do to form a liquid core is to start with a gas core and condense it down by pressurizing. So that's one reason to be interested. Another is that we were also interested in decompression sickness and bubbles and decompression sickness. What happens when you have a pressurized scenario, high pressure scenarios? What happens to bubbles? So we started to study these, and we studied basically two different lipids, pure DPPC and Cervanta. Cervanta is a lung surfactant replacement therapy. It's typically given to neonates who are born prematurely, because lung surfactant is one of the last things to develop during maturation in the womb. So premature babies often come out without lung surfactant, and you can inject this lung surfactant therapy into the lungs, and it will coat the lungs and stabilize the lungs and allow the child to breathe, and then the child will make his or her own surfactant that will then coat the surface. Cervanta, so there's different products that are out there. Cervanta just happens to be one of them, and it happens to be one that's extracted from bovines, from cow. So what they do is they take the cow lung, they mince it up, they do a liquid-in-liquid extraction to get the hydrophobic components, and then they enrich those hydrophobic components with primarily DPPC and stearic acid. And so we looked at pure DPPC versus Cervanta. The thing about lung surfactant is the main component of lung surfactant is DPPC. So DPPC is in both of these, but Cervanta also has these other lipids and these hydrophobic proteins, SPB and SPC, that are also in surfactant, okay? Lung surfactant. So we had to pressurize bubbles, and we had to put them under pretty significant pressure, so we couldn't use the same dissolution chamber that I showed you in fire because it would break under that pressure. So we had to build a new pressure chamber and with thicker glass and so forth. But again, we can watch bubbles dissolve. And these are bubbles, well, they're not only dissolving, but they're pressurizing. So they're compressing and dissolving at the same time. I'll show you more evidence for that. So these are our pressurization rates. It was a linear pressurization rate, so the pressure is increasing linear time at 0.5 kilopascal per second or up to 2.3 kilopascal per second. And this shows Cervanta, and this shows DPPC. One of the interesting things is that Cervanta, you see this characteristic crumpling and then restoration of the spherical shape, the smoothing. So crumpling and smoothing, etc. Where for pure DPPC, you don't see that. So Cervanta has DPPC, which is considered the main component that stabilizes and gives it its rigidity. But in fact, pure DPPC is not nearly as rigid as Cervanta. It's kind of interesting. So I think there's some really interesting physics going on with flow Cervanta. This shows the projection surface area. We take that surface area and apply it versus time. For Cervanta and for DPPC. And what happens is as you pressurize these, eventually it condenses. So suddenly the radius just it gets really small. For the Cervanta, we get this crumbling behavior, particularly between here and here. Okay, so we're going to analyze that. If you look at how much the area changes in those little jumps, and you plot that at time as a function of time, you get these kind of area velocity seismographs. Okay? And we didn't come up with this on our own. There was another researcher, Gopal and me at the University of Chicago, who were studying the flat Langmuir monolayers, and they also observed this kind of buckling and shifting behavior in flat layers of lung surfactant. And so they plotted these jumps, what they call jerks, as a function of time, as what they call a seismograph. It gives you a sense of how big the jerks are. But the interesting thing is you can kind of see here there's no correlation with time. They're not large and decreasing with time or small and increasing with time. It's kind of random, stochastic. In fact, the average change in area is pretty uniform across all the different pressurization rates. The only thing that's changing is the frequency of the collapse events. So that's kind of interesting in terms of the structural mechanics of the bubble. If you plot the volume as a function of time and then normalize by the initial volume, here's the experimental data. Here's for ideal compression. Ideal compression means you have an ideal gas and you're just compressing it and there's no dissolution. There's no loss of gas molecules that's around the environment. And you can see that the data falls underneath that. Okay? So we know that there must be some dissolution. But if you look at pure dissolution, that is if you take the Epstein plus equation without any shell resistance and you apply that, then that's the green curve. So it falls between these two curves. It's really closer to the compression curve. But what's telling is when you go, these are DPPC and these are Cervanta. If you look at Cervanta in this regime and in this regime, with these two compression rates, 0.5 or 2.3, these are the slowest and the fastest, you see that the volume is actually larger than it's expected to be under compression. And the only way that can happen is if the shell is resisting pressurization. It's like a negative surface tension. Right? It's not really a negative surface tension because there's no such thing as a negative surface tension. But it's a mechanical rigidity that some of the stress from the pressure, outside pressure, is going into the shell. The shell is sustaining some of that stress. Now it doesn't happen throughout the entire curve. Okay? Or if it does happen, but what happens is eventually the lipid the gas core starts to dissolve. Okay, so this made us realize we had to go back and evaluate a theory that includes some mechanical resistance. Okay? So I'm going to show you, I have it here in kind of paragraph form, which is not the best for presentation, but I wanted you guys to be able to have a full derivation. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to go ahead and read it. Here, an analytical model is derived from the compression or dissolution of a microbubble subjected to a linear increase in hydrostatic pressure. Fixed law describes the accumulation of gas in the bubble over time, as we saw before. Okay? Where N is the number of moles, T is time, K is the mass transfer coefficient, A is the bubble surface area, C sub S is dissolved gas concentration below the surface, and C infinity is the dissolved gas concentration in the liquid. Henry's law relates the dissolved gas concentration to the partial pressure for dilute solutions at equilibrium. So here we're going to actually use H, and we're going to define it as the concentration of gas in the water over the concentration of gas in the bubble. Okay. So H is Henry's constant. In this form, it's actually called an Ostwald coefficient, and C sub W is the dissolved gas concentration. The molar gas concentration, C sub G, is equal to P over BT, pressure over universal gas coefficient at time and temperature, is determined by the ideal gas law, where P is the gas partial pressure, B is the gas constant, T is temperature, and substitution of that into there gives, and there into there gives the mass balance around the bubble. So AKH over BT, P infinity minus P sub S. Before pressurization begins, the medium is equilibrated with gas at atmospheric pressure. So this is an experiment where we completely degassed the medium, and then we saturated with perfluorobutane at the working temperature prior to doing this experiment. And in Boulder, Colorado, that's not 1 atmosphere, that's 0.8 atmospheres. So if you ever come to Boulder, come visit me, and I'll take you on a hike, and don't be surprised if you get shortness of breath, because that little 0.2, that 20% of the atmosphere makes a big difference. The pressure actually decreases exponentially with elevation. Okay, so for a single gas component, the partial pressure is equal to the total pressure inside the bubble. Okay, and the shell interfacial rheology has been shown to significantly influence bubble response to pressure changes. Here we adopt the exponential elasticity model by Paul et al. Now this is, Paul was a student of Koshik-Sharkar at University of Delaware. Okay? So this is really Koshik's group to describe the surface dilatational elasticity. Elasticity is capital E of the shell. So E is an exponential function. It's E naught, which is this initial elasticity, times exponential of negative alpha beta. And that's like as simple of a constituent equation as you can get. It's exponential, but we just throw in an alpha and beta. What is beta? Beta is a term. It's like a normalized area compared to the initial area. So it's like how much the area has changed from the initial state. Okay? Normalized by the initial area. So it's A bubble surface area over E naught, initial bubble surface area, quantity squared, which just winds up being R over R naught squared. And then alpha was determined by these guys when they were doing ultrasound studies to be a value of 0.5, and we took that value of 0.5. So the surface tension, sorry, it shouldn't be gamma, it should be sigma, is sigma naught plus E times beta. E being the elasticity of the shell, E is beta. So surface tension is equal to this. So here, this is the initial surface tension of the surface, but we assume that that is 0. So a microbubble is modeled as a sphere on which the interfacial stresses cause a jump or a pressure drop in the normal stress at the interface. And Sarkar defined this pressure jump by this dynamic boundary condition. So you have P is inside the bubble, pH is outside the bubble, and then we have these terms. This term is due to the viscosity of water. So if you compress a bubble really fast, the viscosity of water will impede that. But this term goes to 0 because it's a slow dissolution. This is kappa is the surface viscosity of the lipid shell. I showed you data for that in the very first lecture. R dot is relatively small, so that one goes away. We assume that the initial surface tension is 0, so that one goes away. And this is the only thing left. Only the elasticity. Okay. So I just told you, so this is what we have left. So these equations can be solved numerically and fit to the data to determine what is, and the only parameter that's unknown here is E sub none, or the initial elasticity. So, unfortunately, the model failed to accurately fit the experimental data with the mass transfer coefficient set to a constant value. It did a pretty good job, but it wasn't perfect. And we wanted to get perfect. So to benefit the data, we introduced an empirical relation for the mass transfer coefficient. What we noticed is that initially the bubble was dissolving faster than expected. And probably because it was being compressed faster, because compression is initially fast and then it slows down as you continue to pressurize. And so we just introduced a simple expression here, which is that the mass transfer coefficient as the wall velocity increases linearly with the wall velocity. And this comes out to be E about a factor of about 1,000. So K naught is the mass transfer coefficient in the static case, and then epsilon is some empirical constant that we set to 10 to the 30. Okay, so K naught is equal to R over D, and then this part becomes thick, a bigger shell, so there's a resistance in the shell. Okay, so when we apply this theory that now takes into account the mechanics, this is dPPC at different compression rates. It fits the data perfectly, almost perfectly. And you can see that the elasticity is increasing, but it starts to hit the plateau value, particularly at the higher pressurization rates. And you can look at the bubble pressure in black versus the hydrostatic pressure, and initially they're the same, but they start to deviate. So the pressure inside the bubble is actually less. What's interesting is that we compressed these bubbles all the way until they condensed, and it turned out that this pressure difference is consistent with the difference between the hydrostatic pressure and the pressure at which it was supposed to condense, the equilibrium pressure. So that was some kind of evidence some independent evidence that this model might be accurate. And in fact, the pressure inside the bubble may actually be less than the pressure at exterior. Now this is a case of we're pressurizing these bubbles, okay? So it may be that when a bubble is just dissolving in a degassed environment, it's not dissolving fast enough for this to be the case. But at least when we're pressurizing. We also looked at Cervanta. Remember, Cervanta is the lung surfactant. And we see it fits the data great. And we also see very similar behavior. Elasticity initially increases and then starts to plateau. And we see bigger difference between bubble pressure on the inside and on the outside. Again, bigger difference on the inside and the outside. And it also happened that the Cervanta required more pressure to condense than the dPPC. So it's in line with that observation as well. The fitting parameter in all those cases was E sub naught. That was a sole fitting parameter. And it did a pretty good job of fitting. You can see these error bars are relatively small. But what was interesting is it was pretty constant for dPPC, but it seemed to increase for Cervanta. Okay? So there's maybe some biophysical implications to this, but we really don't know why this is the case. But it's just something to keep in mind that maybe the elasticity is a function of the strain rate. Okay? We know about materials that do this. we call them shear hardening materials or shear stiffening materials, right? Like starch in water is one of those examples. It becomes, if you make a bath of the starch water, you can run across it, but if you stand still in the middle, you'll sink in, right? It's a shear thickening fluid. Maybe the bubble surface is also, the lipid shell is also a shear thickening fluid. It seems to be what this is indicating. Not so much for pure PPPC, but for surfactant. So some surfactants, so there may be some difference in these surfactants. It makes sense that there is. Okay, so to summarize, we derived the Epstein-Clausen equation. It looks something like this, okay? And I lost my R term here. I'll go back and find that. And then, oh, I'm sorry, the R term isn't here. It's in here now. K naught is the mass transfer coefficient, which is D over R. Mass transfer model, we just add this term here. Constitutive equation for mass transfer, we had D over R for Sherwood number equals 2 for pure diffusion. And if the bubble is dissolving really fast, you might have to add another term to account for convection. So we suggest that this constitutive equation would be valid. For the mechanics, we use Sarkar's value, where alpha was 1.5, so it becomes 3 beta at 2. And once you have this elasticity, then you can determine what the surface tension is. And just remember that beta is defined in this way. Okay? So with that, time is about 10:26. We have it ready at 10:30, so we have 5 minutes or so for questions, and then we can take a break, and then we can have more questions. So any questions so far? It's a lot more mathematical, less phenomenological than what you saw in the prior lectures, but that's one of the points of this, is to really dig into the whole mass transport instance. Question from the back.
How you have Sarmaja drop, so it goes to a non-spherical shape, right?
Yeah.
But after some time, it goes to a spherical shape.
Yes.
So during this non-spherical, this transition phase, it makes some structures on the surface, right?
Right.
So then how it goes to a perfectly spherical shape again?
Well, what we think is happening is this is characteristic of a buckling and failure. So it's what happens. There was some beautiful research that was done by Claudia Lee's group at the University of Chicago, and actually published in Science. And it was to deal with surfactant layers, but actually more general than that. These inextensible thin films. So initially the film is flat, but as you compress it, it becomes what they call inextensible, which means you can't extend it. It also means incompressible. You can't compress it in plane. It's like a sheet of paper, and instead it bends. And initially it bends at some characteristic wavelength. It depends on the bending modulus of the film. And then, and also maybe if there's water here, the water has gravity, and so that also affects it. But there's an initial, this is buckling. Okay? And then what happens is that at some point here you get a localization of stress and a release of stress. And so it just collapses. And you can see this if you take a piece of paper and you kind of bend it, you'll see a kind of a big fold will form. And that's initially you were getting these waves that you couldn't see them, but then eventually it just buckles or fails, basically. And so that could explain what's happening. The bubble is like wrinkling, but it's in this three-dimensional, around the sphere kind of wrinkling, and then it hits this instability, this stress localization, and then all the stress is relieved as a fold projects away from the surface. And a fold is actually a fairly stable structure. So if you can imagine a gas bubble with the lipid around it, etc. Here, this lipid could come out in the form of a fold. And it works because you form a bilayer. So you don't have to expose those hydrophobic groups to the water. So folding outwards is actually thermodynamically possible. I think folding inwards is more problematic because you have to you have the head groups coming in, but it may also be the case. I think there was some recent evidence that was published, I think by the Chicago group, if I'm not mistaken, that indicated that it may be that monolayers fold up instead of down in some cases. So probably what's happening is initially you're here, this is the crippling, and then when it becomes a sphere, this happens. And once this happens, this could break away and diffuse off. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, I think it's maybe take a break time. Okay. Started. So the next vector will be gas exchange. We saw how bubbles are stable in a single gas environment. But when you generate bubbles, you're going to inject, in many cases for biomedical applications, you're going to inject it into the bloodstream. And you might start with propylbutane or sulfur-hexane as a gas 4, but they're going to exchange with the metabolic gases that are present in the blood. Oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide. So you have to take those into account. So you may initially have an SF6 bubble, which is a diffusive exchange and equilibrium with SF6 in the surrounding medium. An example of an SF6 bubble is solid reductive. But as soon as you inject it into the bloodstream, now the SF6 is going to diffuse out, and oxygen and nitrogen, carbon dioxide are going to be able to diffuse in. And until they all reach diffusive exchange. So the problem of gas exchange, what happens to the bubble, is the integral fate of the bubble, has been explored before by several researchers, and these are a handful of them that I chose, starting back in 1989, going all the way to more recently Sarkar. I showed you that paper in 2009. Kadyar is also a researcher in Sarkar's group. Ricard and Van Loo are interesting because they study bubbles as blood substitutes. So that is trying to use bubbles to replace red blood cells. They did some beautiful modeling. Unfortunately, the application never really panned out, but they have some very nice modeling in this area. And the question that we asked is, well, let me shoot back for just a second and just show you this. This shows what's expected for an SF6 bubble that's suddenly injected into blood. Okay, so the total volume is shown here. So it starts here, and then it jumps up, and then it goes back down. So the bubble actually grows and then shrinks. Okay? The volume of SF6 is going down, but the bubble is growing because there's a large influx of nitrogen. Okay? And there's also a small influx of other gases that are present in venous blood, such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water. So this has been modeled before, but they never really took into account these terms for the shell that I've just discussed with you. So we asked, is there an effect of the lipid shell? We know that the lipid shell has some impact on, has some mechanical properties, as you can see here. This is a study by Dennis Kim and David Needham at Duke University. And then also the study I just showed today, earlier, on the gas dissolution. So we know that the shell has an impact. So we thought about modeling the gas exchange problem. Now, with the gas exchange problem, there's some complexity added because you have different species of gas. You have multiple species of gas. Okay? So in that case that I just showed sulfur hexafluoride, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide, or at least 4 gas species that have to be taken into account. Okay, so you need to have an expression for each case. And this is basically the Epstein plus equation in discretized form for numerical simulation. So you have n at tau plus 1, n sub at tau plus 1, that's 1 time step forward, that's the initial time step. Okay. And we also have terms in here. So h, in this case, is the time difference between n and n plus 1. So here's the time, h, and the dn is here, here. Okay. And then we have the other terms, the radius of the bubble, the mass diffusivity, the Henry's constant, sigma is the surface tension, P sub L is the hydrostatic pressure, F is the degree of saturation of species I in the bulk. So F is equal to 1 when it's saturated, F is equal to 0 when it's completely unsaturated. And then you have another term here. And this term takes into account all the other species where I is not equal to J. So these are, because the other species will dilute the partial pressure of whatever species you're looking at. Okay, so there's a bunch of coupled equations. We get this equation for each liquid. And this term comes from the species balance plus the diffusive flux. We have a second equation. The total, this equation is mechanical equilibrium of the interface. And it ties together all of these individual terms, or individual equations for each species. So we have a mathematical model. It's just a discretized form of the Epstein plus equation that are coupled together because we have multi-components. And we wanted to take a look at this. This was work that was done by a former graduate student of mine, James Kwani, who's now an assistant professor at NTU Singapore. So this was his dissertation project, essentially. And he built this chamber as a perfusion chamber. And he threaded through a hollow fiber. And then he could add a solution, and then he could perfuse a solution through there around the hollow fiber. So this fit onto a microscope stage. This is the bird's eye view looking down. This is the side view. So we have the objective and the condenser, so it's an inverted scope. And here's the perfusion chamber, the top cover slip and the bottom cover slip. And then there's a hollow fiber on the side, this guy here. So there's a fiber here, a fiber here, and the bubble is sitting up against this fiber. And then you can exchange this fluid very quickly using the perfusion chamber. This hollow fiber is very permeable to gases. It holds the bubble in place, but it's permeable to gases. I think it has a 16,000 molecular cutoff, or 30,000 molecular cutoff, so it's quite porous. The ball thickness is about 16 microns. And it turns out that we, for the most part, we can assume that this is a negligible resistance. So he took images of bubbles, and these are larger bubbles. You can tell this is a 10 micron scale bar, but so it's 40 or 50 microns in diameter, and so, or sorry, about 60 microns in diameter. And the bubble, as we expect, it initially grows and it shrinks. Now, in this case, we used as a surfactant SDS, or sulfur dodecanyl sulfate. And the reason we use this is because it's a soluble surfactant. It's a constant surface tension. Because we didn't want to start with lipid, which has this kind of unknown surface tension properties. So we started with SDS because it's a well-behaving surfactant. And SF6 is the filling gas inside. And we didn't use venous blood, we use air. So it has nitrogen at 79% and oxygen at 21%. Okay, so initially the bubble is stable. Okay, it's initially stable and it's surrounded by sulfur hexafluoride filled or dissolved saturated medium. So there's sulfur hexafluoride dissolving in and out of the bubble and it's at equilibrium, so it's stable. Then we suddenly exchange the surrounding environment with air saturated medium and nitrogen diffusion, nitrogen and oxygen, which have a higher diffusion coefficient than sulfur hexafluoride, diffuse even faster. Okay? And because they're diffusing it faster than sulfur hexafluoride can leave, the bubble actually grows and then it shrinks. And it grows to a certain point, but then surface tension takes over, nitrogen and oxygen equilibrate, and then it starts to shrink. So the red is the experimental curve, and the black is the simulated curve. And if you do the simulation, then you can also account for each of the gas species, so you can plot nitrogen and oxygen and sulfur hexafluoride. So initially it's pure sulfur hexafluoride, and then that leaves. Nitrogen diffuses in very quickly before sulfur hexafluoride is left. That's why it grows. Oxygen also diffuses in quickly. But then it becomes, at this point, it's basically an air bubble. So after a few minutes, it's an air bubble, and now the air bubble is dissolved. So if you look at the dissolution time as a function of diameter, you can compare the experimental data to the theory, and it does a pretty good job of fitting the data. So at this point, we're pretty confident that the model is accurate to the experiment, that they're well coupled. And so we tried to use lipid. And lipid gave us a very different result. So here's the SDS curve, and here's the lipid curve. A couple things to recognize. Lipid doesn't grow nearly as much as SDS. Grows a little bit, and then shrinks, and then it kind of, instead of continuing to shrink like SDS does, it slows down and slowly dissolves, and then it flattens out and becomes sort of really stable at a diameter of about 1 to 2 microns. So the bubble does initially grow, but then it shrinks. In this case, you can see it's almost non-spherical in a sense, and then it dissolves. So very different behavior than SDS. It's an insoluble surfactant, it's lipid, so that's in some sense what we expect. And we tried to explain what's happening with lipid as you have now we fit the diameter using surface tension as a free parameter. And before it was completely priority prediction. Now we are allowing the model to fit the data via the surface parameter, surface tension. What we saw is surface tension shoots up to some very high value, and then comes down, and then slowly decreases and then stabilizes at a very low tension. So when we consider this as at the time, this is about the time that the Marmot model came out. And so we assume that this was this breakup tension, and then you have collapse, steady collapse in this region, and then you eventually have jamming of the layer. So this is how we would describe this.
The surface tension was measured.
The surface adjusts the surface tension.
Which method? Using Penderlock method?
I'm sorry,
He's asking if the surface tension was measured or it was estimated.
it's estimated by fitting the data, fitting the model to the data. So once you have the surface tension data, you can determine, you can actually make a surface pressure versus area isotherm, which is kind of interesting. So this is like a Langmuir isotherm for a bubble. And we saw this kind of interesting increase in surface pressure until it reached some point which we determined the collapse point and flattens out. And eventually goes to about 0 tension. So that was larger bubbles. We followed it up with smaller bubbles, and we see even different behavior for smaller bubbles than what we saw for larger bubbles. Okay? So these bubbles are now about the size range that we want in medical imaging, 1 to 10 micron diameter range. And we looked at different acyl chains, DMPC, corticosteroid combination. And this bubble is seen to initially grow a lot, and then shrink, and then restabilizes at a diameter that's close to the initial diameter. And it remains stable for some time, and then it starts to dissolve. And so these are just the corresponding imaging snapshots. So let's DMPC. We also tried DSPC. So you can get a sense of the comparison of the molecules. It's 18 versus 14 carbon chain length. And instead of this big growth regime, if you see a small growth regime, again, it stabilizes at a diameter close to the initial diameter, but it's stable for a much longer period of time. And this is on the order of 150 seconds. This is stable out to 500. And then it starts to shrink again, and then it restabilizes. We call this DS2, and it's final stabilized diameter. So initial stabilized diameter, final stabilized diameter. This is this lag time. T theta is this lag time. It's stable, then it starts to dissolve again. TD is the time it dissolves from the initial stable diameter to the final stable diameter is this time. And you can see the bubble. So it initially grows, but not a lot. Okay, and then it shrinks and then it stabilizes. So this shows DSPC for different initial sizes. So I showed you one that was initially about 7 microns diameter. So around here. Okay. We also looked at one at 10, 15, down. Now these larger ones exhibit the behavior more like the DMPC. They grow a lot and then shrink back close to their original size, shrink and then restabilize. You can see it restabilizing again here. So we looked at this. Okay, what is the maximum diameter over the initial diameter? So initial diameter versus the ratio of the maximum diameter of the initial diameter. And they were all a little bit larger. Okay. The maximum diameter was always a little bit larger, but they all grew a little bit. But at over 10 microns, you got some bubbles that grew a lot, some that didn't grow a lot, some that didn't grow a lot. Okay. So there's some kind of mechanical resistance to this expansion. And as the bubble gets bigger, there's less mechanical expansion, less mechanical resistance. But sub 10 micron bubbles basically don't grow like that. And when we looked at this data, we were actually somewhat relieved because if you inject these bubbles into the bloodstream, you don't want them to grow into a big bubble, right? You want them to stay about the same size. So again, you get this primary stabilization. The bubble, this is like a DMPC type of bubble that initially grows and it shrinks. This is for DSPC. If we look at the initial diameter versus the initial stable diameter, it matches up very nicely. And we use this we call this resealing or self-healing behavior. So the shell expands, right, fractures, and then it comes back and it reseals and restabilizes. At most of the time, exactly the same diameter that it started at. Okay. So our squared value of that line was 0.99. So that's pretty good self-healing behavior. The secondary stabilization depended a little bit on the initial diameter, but there was a lot of scatter in the data. And when we plotted it, instead of trying to plot it versus the initial diameter, we plotted it as a histogram instead. We actually got a really nice histogram. So the R squared for a line is 0.42, but for the histogram is 0.94. So to us, that said, it's not really dependent on the radius. The final diameter is it just restabilizes at some diameter. And we call this the stable diameter. And this has been observed in many different types of experiments, the stable diameter. It's been observed in acoustic dissolution experiments where you hit them with pulses and you cause it to dissolve, and they dissolve down to the small size in the 1 to 2 diameter range, 1 to 2 micron diameter range, and then they stabilize for long periods of time. So we wanted to focus on just this region, the gas exchange region. The only this region where it's growing and shrinking back down to its original size. This region. And we fit the data, we fit the model to the data, and we also have to include a term for the shell resistance to gas permeation, as well as water resistance. The water resistance is the ROE term. We have the surface tension term. Now the gas resistance, the shell resistance, we fit it to an energy barrier theory that also depends on the area of the shell. So we have to account for the fact that the shell is expanding and contracting. And we have good reason to believe that it works because of the plotted with a function of surface tension for this guy's linear behavior when you plot ln of the transport coefficient times this. So this seems to fit a nice exponential. So there's a precedent for using this model. It's basically the energy barrier model. So you have to have A, that's the area of the diffusing species. So perfluorobutane is going to have a larger diffusing area, or collision area, than oxygen or nitrogen. It depends, actually, you can determine from the critical properties, which is kind of nice. So, there's also a prefactor that depends on the number of carbons per acyl chain. So we have that in there. This is also good. So this, we know this function, basically. And because we've done these experiments with oxygen, we can use that as a basis for the other gases. So we can fit the model to the data. The data are the circles, and the model is the red. And then pressure, excess pressure is the fitting parameter, and from that we can extract surface tension. First, here's what the gases do. Again, sulfur hexafluoride dissolves out, nitrogen dissolves in, oxygen dissolves in, and you always have a little bit of water vapor in there. So here's the surface tension plotted, and this is beta. This is, again, the same beta that we had before, the fractional area change. So initially, surface tension rises, and it goes up to about 73 millimeters per meter, which is the surface tension of water. And it goes in a fairly linear fashion. And then what's interesting is the bubble continues to expand. The bubble continues to expand, but the surface tension decreases. So the bubble's expanding, the surface tension is decreasing. Then the bubble is compressing, and surface tension decreases back to zero, and this is where we see it was. So this was a bit interesting to us. What's happening here? Well, if you imagine that the shell fractures, the lipid can diffuse into the vacuum of area on the surface. And when it does, it's going to reduce the surface tension. And in fact, this surface tension started to approach the surface tension of a free of lipid equilibrium. Surface tension is about 25 millimeters per meter. So here's you can fit each parts of this curve to models, a linear expansion, an exponential decay, and a linear decrease. And you can get these values. This is the area expansion modulus. This is the area compression modulus. This is the breakup tension, and this is the decay rate in this part, the decay rate. Okay, and so different lipids, as we increase acyl chain length from DMPC to PPC to SPC to BPC, we see that the area expansion modulus increases from 5 to 6 to 6.4, and then actually very down to 3.4. The breakup, well, this is where it breaks up. This is breakup tension. They're all about 73 millimeters per meter, so the surface tension of water. The decay rate was faster, so it equilibrated, the surface equilibrated faster for DMPC because it has a higher rate constant here. Right? This is an exponential rate constant. It's in the exponent. DPPC, so it drops from 0.8 to 0.6, 0.2, and then 0.1. So these are much slower to expand. And then the compression modulus basically increases with increasing usage. What was also interesting is we use the same matrix lipid in 2 different emulsifiers. This is a single acyl chain and 2 acyl chains. And you see different properties. Well, roughly, actually, these properties were the same. This property was different. The compression modulus was different, but the decay rate was about the same. So, based on this data and that flag-shaped curve that I just showed you, this is the mechanism that we think to work with. So we have phase separation between the main phospholipid and the pegylated emulsifier. So we have a domain, and an interdomain region. And the interdomain region is less ordered, it's more flexible. So this is what initially stretches. And then eventually it ruptures, okay? And then lipid diffuses into this region. Then during subsequent compression, you condense this lipid and it starts to recrystallize out. So the lipid recrystallizes out, and then you end up with this interdomain region. So, is it going to have the exact same structure as it initially did? Probably not. Particularly if this is a significant amount of time that it's diffusing. So there will be some change in microstructure, but the point is just to get the idea across. So we actually tested this concept that what it does. Can you expand a layer and can you suddenly expand a monolayer from a compressed state and see a decay in the surface tension? So we looked in the literature, and nobody had done this experiment before. As long as Agnes Pockels developed the Langmuir back in the late 1800s. So it's been around for 100 years, and nobody had tried to do this experiment. So we went and did it. The experiment is, you need to compress the monolayer until it's fully compressed, okay? And then let it sit there for some period of time. And then suddenly expand it, fracture it. So you compress it, let it force it together, let it condense, and then suddenly fracture it, and see what happens. And lo and behold, the surface tension decays exponentially. So this is verification to what we saw in the bubble surface. That is, if you take a compressed monolayer of lipid and you suddenly expand it, the surface tension will jump up and then it will decay back down. It will decay back down to a value that's the equilibrium surface tension of about 25 millimeters. So a picture of the bubble again is initially you're stable because you have a bubble that's SF6 environment. And the zero tension in the surface, the monolayer is fully filled. Then you suddenly change the gas environment, and oxygen and nitrogen fuse in, the bubble grows, and the shell initially expands and then ruptures. Then the domains dissolve into this the interdomain region, fractured region. Okay. And then the lipids, as it starts to compress, as oxygen and nitrogen start to dissolve out, now it's under the influence of surface tension and the loss pressure. So you're forcing oxygen and nitrogen to dissolve out, you recondense, and then eventually you restabilize. Again, it's not necessarily the case that that's microstructure will be the same, and you may alter the microstructure, especially if this is in a prolonged period of time. If this is very fast, and you're not allowing much diffusion, then you'll end up with the same microstructure. But if this is prolonged, it could be different. Okay. Okay, in fact, that was yeah, so that was gas exchange. I forgot that I got up at 3 very early this morning, and I was changing some other slides by this slide, so sorry for that. But that's basically gas exchange in a nutshell. I mean, those are the experiments that have been done on it. There haven't been a lot more experiments done on microbubble gas exchange since that study was published, actually. In fact, not that I'm aware of. You know, what some of the take-homes from that are that the bubble doesn't really grow as much as those previous models said it would. And you can actually model that, why it's not growing. It's because there's some elasticity that's preventing, that's resisting the growth. Okay? And it turns out that that elasticity is actually not far off from the elasticity that we modeled in, or that we measured in those other experiments that I showed you on the first day. So there is some kind of continuity there. The bubble can rupture and it can reform, it can self-heal. Again, that's another nice thing about lipid. I'm not sure what would happen with BSA. I mean, you guys should try one of these days. Somebody should try the experiment with BSA and some of these other bubbles. And it would be interesting to try some commercial contrast agent bubbles and see what their particular responses are. But that's basically what happens. Take-home message number one: the bubble doesn't grow as much as theory might scare you to believe it would. In fact, the bubble is quite stable in size. But number two, you start with a SF6 bubble or a PFP bubble or something like that, and after about a minute, it's turned into an air bubble, even if it continues to circulate. So that's another important take-home point, that it's, the bubble is still circulating, but now it's an air bubble. So when you model it, there's a parameter called the specific heat ratio that is quite different for PFP than it is for air. For air, it's about 1.4, and for perfluorocarbon, it's about 1. And so that's a 40% difference in that term. So when you're modeling it, that's an example of a term that you might want to consider. So it becomes an air bubble, which might be surprising to most folks. I think you think of it, well, it's a sulfur hexafluoride bubble, so you inject it and it just continues to be a sulfur hexafluoride bubble, and that's not the case at all. And on Friday, I'm going to talk about biocompatibility, and I'm going to show you some experiments where patients were hooked up to gas. Well, they weren't hooked up to gas chromatography. They blew into a bag, and they saved that bag, and then they did analysis with gas chromatography. And they found out that most of that gas gets expired in the first 2 minutes, even though we know that the bubbles can circulate for longer than that. So, like maybe 5 to 10 minutes. So, the data is all seem to be consistent there. That you're transitioning from a sulfur hexafluoride or perfluorocarbon bubble, and you're ending up with an air bubble, and it continues to circulate. And it's the virtue of the shell that allows it to be